that'll pretty much be that. So we have the field. I've already talked enough about it. And we have the habitus, talked a lot about that. But the field should be thought of as a set of positions, symbolic positions. All of the fields are orchestrated by the symbolic order, or are parts of the symbolic order. And the positions inside of each field are unintelligible without thinking about how they are related to one another. And positions relate to dispositions. Different people with different dispositions are going to be better cut out for certain kinds of positions in a field. He uses the example at some point of a cop. A cop is a good example. Why are cops so often this certain kind of personality type that most people find repugnant? Obviously not all. There is this sort of like selfless, caring, civically engaged disposition that can become a cop. But this sort of bullying disposition is also obviously a kind of disposition that can be attracted to that position. Well, he also uses the example of the aggressive civil servant who enjoys giving people a hard time within a bureaucracy. And he says that the question of whether that's the disposition or the position in a lot of cases is the wrong question, because the position often only recruits for at like this sort of structural level. It filters out most people who don't match certain dispositions, and it attracts certain kinds of dispositions. But then he uses like the example of a teacher, a primary school teacher versus a social worker. And at the time, he's saying in France that the position of the primary school teacher is very rigid. It requires a very specific kind of disposition, whereas the social worker has a lot of flexibility. Like that position has a lot of flexibility. And so if you're a very unorthodox kind of person and you kind of like to do things your own way, you can get the job as that primary teacher, but it's either going to chew you up and spit you out, or it's going to wear away at you, and eventually you will conform to the position. Whereas, if you were that way and then you take on this more flexible position as a social worker, well, you can kind of make it what you want. The underground relates in the sense that there are a lot of not well-defined positions, and it kind of is inclusive for now of almost any dispositions. But it is also governed by the attention economy. Everything centers around the attention economy. Everything comes down to attention and money. And therefore, there will be more successful positions that are inculcated or fostered by that situation. And then there will be different kinds of dispositions that are more well or less adapted or adaptable to those positions. When we think about the medium from a critical media theory perspective, and we're thinking about ways of hacking the attention economy so that we can still participate while not giving in fully, where we can counter the worst tendencies and hopefully harness other tendencies, just being realists about the fact that there are tendencies in the attention economy that seem to work, right? I wouldn't be doing this as a live stream if there wasn't something working about it. But also going against the medium and not just doing all the things that it tells us to do. Trying to find ways to color outside the lines. Well, the underground is more open to this kind of experimentation than academia is. And so there's going to be a lot of people who feel the need to do things in a less orthodox way as academia becomes increasingly less scholastic, as there's less and less schole. And we will be able to experiment with new positions and dispositions. So people have lectured throughout history and used whiteboards throughout history. But having the camera set up in this way and using Zoom and YouTube in this way with OBS and all of these other, this is all an experiment with the medium. And an experiment with the medium is not just an experiment with the message, which is to say also how we as messengers and participants also get shaped, but it's also an experiment in positions and dispositions. And I think that might also be why so many people who are into theater are attracted to this experiment. We've got a lot of people who are into theater. And I think that this is part of the reason. Because this is a performance. We're always performing in a sort of sense, even if we're not explicitly performing. But like, we're experimenting with different ways of being human, different stylizations of life. We're experimenting with different media. And in the process, we're playing with positions and dispositions. Now, the last thing I have to say about it is just elusio and libido. Every field has an elusio, and every habitus has its libido. And this will be where we turn it over to Mikey, who will be talking about the superego and the big other. And the question I want to pose is, if every habitus has its own kind of libido, obviously we'll want to think about like the libido. We'll want to think about, well, what is the kind of, what can we say about libidinal economy that we all have in common? That's going to be like obviously what Lacan is really good for. As opposed to thinking, yeah, but what is the specific libido of the person who likes to run marathons? And is it different than the kind of libido of a person who likes to play basketball? And is it different than the kind of libido of a person who likes to read a lot of books? He's going to say that in practical life, in political life, in business relations, it's always this libido dominandi. Libido dominandi. Whereas in the scholarly fields, in the liberal arts, it's libido siendi. Libido siendi. Which basically is the drive to dominate, which I think has a lot to do with, or at least there's a lot of ways of rhyming that with will to power. And libido siendi, which is the love of knowledge, the drive to know, wanting to understand. And properly fitting into the scholarly pursuits skole requires a sublimation, he says, a sublimation of libido dominandi into libido siendi. Now, he's not a psychologist. He doesn't think a lot about how this works. He's just saying that is one of the conditions of a successful academic being able to inhabit the habitus required by the field, by any scholarly field. I think that was more true in his time, and I think that there's a different kind of hustle and grind mindset that doesn't necessarily need skole in order to succeed in academia today. It shows the sign value of work having done, lots of time spent doing research. But that comes from gutting texts and doing readings of abstracts and citing everybody who's important from the conference. It doesn't necessarily mean really being in this sort of scholarly mindset. Sure, they go on to reify the scholarly perspective, but without actually having the privilege, much less advantage that comes from genuine schole.